Welcome to the Professional Investment Podcast. I'm Charlotte Moore, award-winning journalist and co-founder of Moore Squared Communications. Each episode, we welcome a guest to the show to share their news story of the week. And I'm delighted to welcome Esther Hawley, Head of Retirement Proposition at Standard Life. Welcome to the show, Esther.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's great to be joining you on the show.
Do tell us, what is your news story of the week?
So my news story of this week is titled 6 Key Challenges for the Pensions Commission, and it was published in Pensions Expert on the 6th of October, 2025.
And what is it that sticks out to you about this story? Why did you choose that as your news story of the week?
But I think it covers a number of different points that are all really fundamental to what's going on in pensions. And in particular, my key focus day to day as head of retirement proposition is how do we help people to take the savings they've built up and turn it into retirement income? There's all sorts of different pieces of that jigsaw that feed into the overall picture. And I think a number of those are picked up in this article that, it's not... The wider pieces include things like, are people saving enough? What is an adequate level of pension for people? How do we improve the outcomes for low earners? How do we make pension savings as efficient as possible for people who can't afford to be putting lots more money into their later life savings? How can we make sure that people actually understand the trade-offs and the pros and cons of the choices that they're going to have to make? And some wider pieces of how it fits into sort of not just the pension system, but the wider policy and societal setup that we have in the UK. So I think there's a number of really interesting themes that this article then picks up on.
Yes, sometimes we can, when we sit in the pensions world, forget that this is just one of many competing demands on a government and a policymaker's time, and that also it doesn't exist in isolation in a silo, does it? It fits with many other things that affect us as we retire and move into old age, such as social care and healthcare and all the rest of it. And it's quite a policy conundrum at times, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So, and, to take, for example, some of the stuff that I think about around decumulation, it's a challenge enough to work out how to help people fund their retirement income from their pension savings, let alone try to work out how to fund later life care costs. It's a whole different level of expense that most people coming up to retirement simply don't have funds to tackle. So, for today, the focus, in terms of the work that I'm doing and developing is very much on that retirement income piece and sort of living costs. But it just, we can't go anywhere near addressing that bigger question then about, well, actually, retirement is more than just your living costs. There is a question about how you're going to manage that. And yes, things like housing and equity release, and actually, making use of housing assets to fund those later life costs can be very useful part of somebody's retirement planning. And perhaps in the future there'll be ways that we can do more insurance around later life care costs and things. But that's one example of a much sort of higher level, wider problem that we need to tackle as a society, that impinges on how we plan for pensions as well.
And I mean, part of the issue is that we seem to have not really made a decision. I mean, we have made a decision. We've decided to go for auto enrolment because, as somebody said to me candidly today, people are not prepared to pay the cost of DB, but we still seem to be having that debate, don't we, about the best way to not fund retirement, but even sort of do what you do, actually provide an income into retirement. We're still debating, should it be DC, should it be DB, should it be CDC? And DC gets a really bad rep and a lot of criticism, but it does have its advantages, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. DC is not, you're right. People sometimes treat it as the sort of poor cousin of DB, and that DB was this all singing, all dancing, gold-plated thing that people had in the past. But the truth of it is that actually DC does have its advantages, one of which is a sort of sense of ownership that gives people that, it's your money, it's your pension. flip side of that is there's probably too much focus on the amount of your savings rather than the income it will generate as the flip side of that. But that advantage of feeling that sense of ownership is real, and it's the flexibility and to the point that this point about being efficient, because people can't afford to be saving huge amounts up for retirement. We need to be able to make the most of what people can put away. And that means that we need to be able to have ways of taking that money and making it work in the best way for that individual. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we have a chance of doing in DC. Yes, there's work to be done and there's a road to travel on it. But in DB, for example, if you're a single individual from, a lower socioeconomic class and a lower life expectancy as a result, then actually the value you're getting out of your DB pension is going to be much, much lower than the married chief exec who's, going to live for much, much longer. The amount of money that your employer is having to put in to fund the chief exec's pension is much, much bigger than what they're putting in for you. And whereas DC is a bit more of a leveler there, what you put in is, and what your employer puts in is proportionate then to what you get out of it. And it means that you can make it work more efficiently for you, depending on, whether you are single, whether you are part of a couple, or, your own financial circumstances. That's also the big challenge, is how do we help people to make the right decisions for their individual circumstances so that they can make it as efficient as possible for them. But no, I don't think that DC can't be made to work for people in retirement. I very much think it can. And of course, if we put into DC the level of contributions that historically went into DB, then what you would get out of it would be more proportionate to what people got out of DB.
Yes, and this is a perpetual debate, and it's not a question that seems likely to be answered anytime soon, with the government ruling out any changes to contribution levels until the next Parliament. And let's see if it's even the same government is in control of the next Parliament. So there's a big question mark over that, which, as you say, is about, from your perspective, is about making what you have work as efficiently as possible. And we are the Professional Investment Podcast, so one of those ways to make it efficiently is to really sort of maximize the investment you can get without taking silly amounts of risk. We've had decumulation going for not a long time, for about a decade now, and now we're starting to think about retirement income, with the government saying it wants simplified choices and it wants members to be able to access a retirement income. So how are you thinking about those sort of investment challenges, and how does that fit into sort of the other challenges that you manage and think about as you develop your retirement proposition?
Yeah, so I think if we go back to when I first started getting involved in DC, the DC investment was very simple. You invested for growth in the early years, and then as somebody approached retirement, you de-risked, and the more sophisticated strategies in those days, although it became more common, would target what you might be expected to do at retirement, whether that was to buy an annuity or take your income flexibly post freedoms. That's not really the world we're in anymore, right? Retirement, it's not an efficient, to my previous point, it's not an efficient way to go about your retirement, to plan for that sort of age 65, I'm de-risking to then, that's done. Because from age 65 or 67 or whenever it is you're retiring, you've got a potentially, 20, 30 plus horizon that you might be looking for that income for. And so it's makes no sense at all to then de-risk to the extent that you're going to stay de-risked for 30 years. And so I think the next generation of solutions that we'll see will have much more regards to when you're actually expecting your income to be needed, and to actually invest according to the duration that you're expecting your retirement income to be needed for. And that, that massively improves the returns that you can get, because the cash flows that are 20, 30 years out, you can continue to invest in growth for the time being, and have a chance of keeping up with inflation as well, importantly, of course. without introducing too much risk on your shorter term cash flows, for example. And then the other thing that does is, because you've got a much longer time horizon, you can invest in less liquid assets as well. There's no reason why in decumulation you can't be putting those future cash flows into less liquid assets, because you do have a long time horizon for them. And then that's a whole other world of potential investment for decumulation that isn't really tapped into as things stand today.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, haven't we, when we did this recent event talking about how to make retirement income sustainable, that you can have similar, you're going to slightly shift that portfolio, as you said, and it won't be as sharp as it used to be, where it was like all in equities and then suddenly all in bonds. And it's going to be sort of more sort of smoothed and merged, if we can think about it that way, because you've got this tremendous opportunity as you sort of approach retirement and then move to and through it, that your capital pot is quite big. Well, it's much bigger than when you start, and 1% on £100,000 is much bigger than 1% on £10,000. And at the same time, you've got to manage that the risk of it declining quite dramatically overnight. We'll kind of talk about managing that risk in a little bit, but when it comes to how you think about that asset allocation, how does that asset allocation change, say, from the age of 45, 55, 65 to 75? Is there a big shift? Are you moving gradually out of equities? Are you shifting what kind of private assets you invest in? And how are you thinking about fixed income in that journey now? Because now that we've got inflation and interest rates back, thank you very much, Liz Truss, we now have fixed income being investable again. So how are you thinking about that kind of portfolio configuration?
So a lot of this comes back to this point about making it efficient for the individual, right? So a lot of my focus at the moment is around how we support people at retirement to get from that savings phase and into the payout phase, essentially. And we've got the pension schemes bill now that is going to require us to do default retirement income solutions. And so we need to come up with some ways of offering these things to people with very, very little input from the individual. And so our thinking at the moment is centered around, right, can we break people up into different cohorts? So it's not individualized for them, but group them into different groups depending on, some key features about their retirement. For example, are you still paying rent in retirement? That might significantly affect how much you need in more secure assets than in flexible assets. And then based on that, we can come up with a small number of different preset ways to do retirement that sort of split that fixed income and the flexible income depending on, what the needs of that cohort are. And then what that really allows us to do is to really step up how we do the efficiency of that investment solution then, because we start to know exactly what it is that this individual is expecting to get from their retirement, rather than just trying to cater for something that's sort of a bit generic and hedges your bets and keeps you kind of all right. And so there's a number of things that flow from that then. If you've got that visibility of what those future cash flows can be, then you can invest according to those. I think another really key thing that's come out of a lot of research that I've seen recently is that even better than investing in the fixed income is if you can get somebody to engage with annuity purchase, because that will increase the overall likelihood of getting a good outcome because they've got that guarantee. But that then replaces the fixed income in the portfolio rather than the flexible income then being funded by a bit of fixed income and a bit of growth. The optimal solutions are the ones that then reduce the fixed income to allow for the fact that you've got some annuity guaranteed. But then that leaves you with more of a psychological problem, whereas in the sense that if that's your theoretically correct answer, that all the modelling shows that the best outcomes will be shove your flexible income in as much growth as you can and put your, what you would put in fixed income, guaranteed at, that's pretty psychologically difficult. That's pretty unnerving for an individual in retirement saying, right, I'm going for growth. I'm sticking loads of it into equities. And so I do think there's another role there for investment solutions that help to manage that equity risk, whether that's, protected equities type stuff or something like the smoothed fund. We've got a smoothed fund that we've launched in partnership with Fidelity. And what this does is it invests in growth as well as some fixed income, but the overall return is smoothed by Standard Life as an insurance company. So the price will not follow exactly the underlying asset price, because we will provide a smoothing mechanism over the top to make it a smoother journey, and that can provide then that sort of level of reassurance to individuals that yes, you've still got that exposure to equities and to growth to keep up with inflation, to provide that more optimal, more efficient overall solution, but actually you don't need to worry so much about the ups and downs of it and the impact that has then with sequencing risk and the potential detrimental outcome, that detrimental impact that has on your outcomes of taking money out at a dip in the market. Having a smoothing mechanism in place will sort of give, well, it smooths it. It means you're not necessarily going to be taking it out at a dip in the market, and it can provide that extra level of reassurance. That's not the only way of doing it, right? But we're starting to see more and more of these things start to feature now as options and things that we can, things in the toolkit that we can use to start making retirement more efficient. That's my theme, I think. I think I've got a theme today.
Yeah, making retirement more efficient. So, smoothing, I don't want to necessarily get into sort of deep technical detail of how you do that. I imagine it's through some derivatives as well, but or maybe just you providing the extra cash. But when you're thinking about the actual asset portfolio, are you thinking, is it getting more exciting and sophisticated for the asset managers listening to this show? Is it moving away from just sort of passive equities and passive bonds, or passive equities into annuities? Are you thinking about, for example, that you might use private equity at the beginning of the process, and then as we move into retirement, we might be moving more into sort of infrastructure debt to give that, again, that inflation protection and that sort of predictable income streams? The way that DB is thinking about that, is that something you're thinking about as well?
So if I leave the smooth fund aside for one moment, because I'm not as close to the inner workings of that fund, on the workplace side of things, this is something that we're looking at in quite a lot of detail at the moment, in terms of how we want to evolve the solutions we've got at the moment to something that reflects everything I've just talked about, and this ability to allow for the duration of the assets that the income that the individual actually needs. And so how we can take what we currently do essentially in the growth phase, the same key principles that underlie and underpin our sustainable multi-asset approach, carry those through into retirement, and incorporate some of the enhancements we're making to that approach, introduction of private assets and that kind of thing. And things like the direct lending and stuff can give really good future income streams, essentially, that can be quite well aligned for retirement income solution, and asset classes that are good value at the moment, might not always be, but so there's a lot of thinking going on in the team at the moment around that, and I can't really say much more than that, because I'm not the one that's closest to it, but my colleague Callum Stewart and his team are all over that at the moment.
So I think that it's a really, really interesting time for the industry. And I know that may live in interesting times as a Chinese curse, but we're at this real cusp point where lots and lots of things are happening and changing all at once. We've got a very interventionist government that has, clear agendas around investing in the UK and wanting greater consolidation. And like you, Esther, obviously believes in greater efficiency, and some kind of competing forces there as well, that if you want scale, you're probably going to push people down, continue to push them down the low cost route, which is maybe going to reduce their investment ambitions, against wanting people to invest in UK private assets, which will push up your investment charges. But also, I do think this whole retirement income is just a really, really fascinating and enormous challenge and opportunity for both you, a pension provider, and for the asset management sector, because you're talking about turning, we've got around 41 billion a year flowing into DC and contributions. We're talking about taking those pots when they're matured and turning it into an income. That is going to be a really fascinating and it's just going to generate a whole new industry in itself, I think, because we haven't really had a DC retirement income industry before. We've now got a DC wealth generating, but the kind of the wealth spending bit, we're basically the industry's running around and thinking about it and thinking how it develops that. If we kind of like bring the discussion back a bit to the article, which, as you mentioned, talks about these broad challenges which don't just affect you, the pension provider, but also the policy makers. Would you think the Pension Commission needs to really focus on? Have you got sort of 3 key issues that really need to be in the headlines of Commission and scope, you know, that are really actually degrading the pension experience for certain demographic cohorts in society, or broader than that?
Yes, I think do have 3 things, possibly a bit broader than is the remit of the Pensions Commission, which I think is what the article is also saying, is that actually, you know, the Pensions Commission won't necessarily be able to solve everything if they can't look broadly enough. But equally, on the flip side of that, if you know, you're in danger of trying to boil the ocean and trying to do everything all at once and not do anything if you make it too broad. But I think from my perspective, there's 3 really big challenges from that wider societal perspective. One is adequacy, and, you know, are the right levels of contributions going in? The automatic enrolment contributions were very carefully thought about when automatic enrolment was first introduced, and set at the level they're at for a reason, not least because, you know, if you're on very low income, there is a point where it's not the most efficient thing to be doing to be putting more into your pension, and actually you should be using that to fund your daily life more, or pay off debts and all that kind of thing. But equally, that means that there's a sort of a middle chunk of people who earn a bit more, who could afford to put more in, arguably, who aren't, because they think that the AE minimums are enough. And they're really not. And so it's, how do you square that circle? How do you keep that balance of making sure that you don't disadvantage people who are already too squeezed, without leaving behind the people who could do a bit more, and without making the whole thing far too complicated? And that's the real challenge to lean into there. I think there are ways and means of doing it. There's probably sort of ways you can tier the contributions and introduce more flexibility and allow you to take some out or put towards a house deposit, that kind of thing. But there's a lot more, I think, that can be explored there as an industry. And that's something that actually the wider Phoenix Group has done quite a lot of work and research into, how to increase contribution levels as well. But that also touches on what I think is a second key point, which is, should you be putting money into your pension, or should you be saving for a house deposit, right? So Standard Life did some analysis a year or so ago, and we just updated the numbers, and it shows some kind of frightening figure. It's £400,000 extra that you would need to have in your pension in order to be able to afford to pay the rent in retirement. On average, you know, there's obviously a huge variation in that, but in general, you'd want to have £400,000 more in your pension pot over and above what you already needed in there in order to meet rental payments through retirement. And we know we're going to have more people coming up to retirement who are private renters in future generations. That's really a frightening number, but B, it means that there's this really difficult decision for people to make in the savings phase in terms of, should I save for a house deposit to get a mortgage and a house and pay that off so that I don't need that extra 400,000, or should I put more into my pension so that I can afford that extra rent in retirement? That is a really difficult decision a balance for an individual to understand. And so I really think there's more that can be done around that to help people and to think through, you know, which of these does take priority. And then the third point is one we touched on at the start, which is, how do pensions and how should pensions sit alongside care costs? What should the expectations be of an auto-enrolment generated pot? You know, as I say, the work that I'm doing at the moment, and certainly the sort of developments the pension scheme bill are expecting, it's focused on a retirement income and providing that income to provide your retirement living costs. But then there's that elephant in the room about, well, okay, that's your living costs, but what if you need, you know, a big uptick in later life in order to fund the care costs, particularly if you're paying rent and you don't own your own home, so you can't do equity release.
Well, not to be
So they're all intertwined.
not to be too commercially cynical about it, but I suspect there's an opportunity there for somebody like Standard Life, who's part of Phoenix Group, to package within your retirement provision. And there is a feeling that master trusts and big insurers like yourself want to become sort of all singing and all dancing providers, to add in some kind of care home insurance, which does actually already exist today, in that package. And maybe there's a way of assessing health benefits through that, or, probability of, sounds a bit morbid, but probability of getting dementia or something like that relative to family history. So there could be solutions, couldn't there, in the future, not wanting to sort of like give you that on a tray, Esther.
Yeah, there's definitely more that can be done in that space, I think, but there's quite a long road to travel, I'd say. I think particularly with the care costs one, the difficulty of it is that because the costs are so high, and actually there's quite a reasonable chance you'll need it. It's not like home insurance, if your home burns down, that's quite unlikely and will be quite expensive. This is something that is very expensive and actually reasonably likely, and then it becomes it's doable to insure it, but the premiums are quite high that you'd need to pay for that. And is that something? So I can't speak authoritatively on it. That's not something I've been working on particularly closely, but I think there must be more we can do as an industry in the future to tackle some of those challenges, but it is not without its difficulties to make something like that work, and to work well.
And as you say, if you've got a generation of renters that are renting into retirement, they won't have a house to sell to fund those costs. So it could become a very even more difficult problem in the future. And keeping kind of like the good of the scheme member in mind, there's a lot of chat, isn't there, when we talk about retirement income, about this kind of like professional hand-wringing. I mean, and some of it's justified and some of it isn't from the industry, about what a difficult challenge it is to provide a retirement income when you have relatively little knowledge about people's circumstances, and you have, multiple pot situations, which the dashboard is hopefully going to help us to solve. But is the hand-wringing overdone, in that you mentioned before, you were talking about there's some people who it doesn't make sense to make greater contributions because they're on the lower end of the income scale. So on a similar basis, when it comes to retirement, there are going to be those people for whom the state pension will be an adequate retirement income. There will be those people at the other end who are going to be wealthy enough to hire a financial advisor, and then there's going to be the bit in the middle, the median. And actually that median is quite a narrow median. I'm not really a statistics expert, but if I can think about it, it's not like a massive median that goes from 20,000 to 2 million. The pots are sort of quite, at the moment, sort of quite converged around a sort of like maybe between 30,000 and 70,000. So maybe providing an income for that is less problematic than maybe we might think at first glance.
I think there's some truth to that. I think we do tend to worry a bit too much and overcomplicate what we're trying to do a little bit. If somebody wants to get the optimal retirement income, they either need to do an awful lot of legwork and research themselves, or they need to pay for advice to do that. There's a big chunk of people who aren't in that category. They're not actually bothered about getting exactly the best, most optimal outcome for them. They just want something reasonably sensible to do. And there are things we can do to help those people then, because there are commonalities between what everybody needs in retirement, or everybody in that group at least. If you put aside the sort of estate planning or, the tax efficiency kind of things that higher net worth individuals would need to be paying for advice for. If you look at that group in the middle, really what we're talking about is retirement income that lasts for life and is, to my theme, efficient, right? So don't pay for longevity protection and buy an annuity for more than you need, but do buy enough for what you need. And then you can have the flexibility that so many people value on everything that you have left over and above that. For some people, they don't need to annuitize more because the state pension will be their lifetime guaranteed income. And, they won't have enough in their DC savings to warrant more than that. In which case, the best value for them from their DC savings is going to be to fund some active early years of retirement, in your 70s, before you start stopping going out and things. And it you know, that people do less as they get older. They do start to rein back on their spending. I remember a couple of years ago, my parents, who were both in their 70s, they were going to go to Madeira on holiday, and then a couple of weeks later they were like, "Oh no, we cancelled it." I was like, "Why? Why are you not going?" "Oh, we couldn't be bothered. We had to renew the passports. It was too much. It was too much effort." It does genuinely happen that when people get to that stage, they don't want to be doing everything that they used to do, you know, 10 years or so previously. So for somebody in that circumstance, it's far more value to actually be taking those DC savings and using them to fund the active years, as long as you've got enough to fall back on to cover your essential spending needs for life, even if you live a really long time.
Yes, well, then my mother's the opposite, and she's 19, just had a knee replacement, and is now kind of like 10 years younger than she was 6 months ago. So,
second lease of life, brilliant.
But on the sort of, just to end on your efficiency theme and talking about sort of giving people, I think, you know, this is a great example where you don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, in that you can't design the perfect solution for every person, but you can design good enough options and a range of those options.
Exactly.
And allow people the flexibility to switch between. Is that kind of how you're thinking? You know, that you'll ask some broad questions, guide people to some products that you've pre-designed, and then allow them to change their options as they go through retirement.
Exactly. Yes, it gives them something to start from, because a blank sheet of paper is scary for anybody.
Okay, well, I think that is a great place for us to end this podcast. Thank you so much, Esther, for being on the show and for sharing all your insights and knowledge. It's much appreciated.
Thank you for having me on. It's been lovely to share some of my thinking with you.
And listeners, if you want to make sure you never miss a future episode of the Professional Investment Podcast, then make sure you hit the subscribe button and do interact with us. Please take part in the poll if you're looking on Spotify, and share any comments you may have. Thank you for listening.